It was in the early haunted hours of September 30th, 1888, that Louis Deemschutz, a humble merchant, guided his small cart through the winding streets, his mind occupied with a simple desire to return home after a long evening. The rhythmic clopping of his horses' hooves echoed against the walls, a steady beat against the eerie silence. But as he turned into Dutfield's yard, the animal suddenly reared, its nostrils flaring, its eyes wide with a primal terror. The cart jerked to a halt, jolting Deemschutz forward as he struggled to steady the beast. The night was thick with fog, curling through the narrow, labyrinthine alleys of Whitechapel like a living thing, swallowing the dim glow of gaslights and muffling the sound of hurried footsteps. The cobbled streets, slick with rain and filth, bore the weary trudge of late-night wanderers, laborious, and lost souls drifting through the slums. A spectral hush had settled over the city, disturbed only by the distant clatter of hooves and the occasional drunken murmur from a nearby alleyway. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the pungent scent of soot, decay, and something darker, something metallic, something like blood. Blinking against the encroaching darkness, he peered ahead. The gaslights offered only meager illumination, their flickering glow casting long, wavering shadows that danced against the damp stone walls. And then he saw it. Her. A woman lay sprawled on the cold ground, her body twisted unnaturally, her skirts darkened by something thick and glistening. Her throat had been slit with brutal precision, a gaping wound still leaking fresh rivulets of crimson onto the unforgiving earth. The shock of it stole the breath from his lungs. For a moment, the world seemed to contract, soundless and suffocating. The weight of dread pressed against his chest as he stared at the lifeless form before him. Was she still breathing? Was there a chance, any chance at all, that she might be alive? He scrambled from his cart, his boots skidding on the slick ground as he reached toward her, his fingers trembling. The answer came quickly, devastatingly. No. She was gone. Her skin was pallid, her eyes unseeing. Death had claimed her with a savage efficiency. Panic clawed its way through his gut as his thoughts raced. He had heard the whispers, the fearful murmurs that skittered through Whitechapel like rats in the dark. The monster that hunted these streets, the faceless phantom who left mutilated corpses in his wake, Jack the Ripper. Had he just been here? Was he still lurking in the shadows, watching? Deemschutz shuddered and turned sharply, his gaze scanning the alleyway, the doorways, the windows above. Nothing. Just the empty silence of the deadened streets. He stumbled back, his throat dry, his heart hammering in his ears. He had to get help. Someone had to see this, had to understand what had just happened. His feet carried him, almost unthinking, toward the nearest door, his knuckles rapping against the wood with frantic urgency. A light flickered on within. Soon, others would come. Soon, the night would be filled with gasps and murmurs, the whispers of horror spreading like wildfire. But as the first voices began to rise, as others arrived and beheld the brutal sight before them, one question loomed above all others, chilling and unanswered. Why had he stopped? The Ripper had never hesitated before, never left his grim work unfinished. Was he interrupted? Frightened away? Or was there something even more sinister lurking within the shadows of Dutfield's yard that night? Something even Jack the Ripper had not anticipated? The year was 1888, and Whitechapel was a district wrapped in fear. 5 brutal murders had shocked the streets of London, each more gruesome than the last. But Elizabeth Stride's murder stood apart. Unlike the others, there were no deep abdominal mutilations, no sadistic carvings on her body, just a single, fatal slash across her throat. Had the killer been interrupted? Or was this the work of someone else entirely? Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish immigrant, had come to London in search of a better life. Like many women in Whitechapel, she struggled to make ends meet, working as a seamstress, a cleaner, and occasionally as a prostitute. She was known to frequent the lodging houses of the East End, where desperation and danger often walked hand in hand. The streets were unkind to women like Elizabeth. Poverty weighed heavy, and every turn down a darkened alley carried a risk. On the night of her murder, she had been seen drinking and socializing, laughing, even. She was last spotted outside a club, speaking with a man whose face was lost to the night. Witnesses recalled her demeanor as pleasant, but the world around her had grown increasingly treacherous. The shadow of the Ripper loomed over Whitechapel, and every woman who walked alone knew the weight of that fear. Yet, for Elizabeth, the night had begun like so many before, filled with fleeting moments of joy amidst the ever-present struggle. Just hours later, she would be dead. Her body was found in Dutfield's yard, her throat cut so deeply that it had nearly severed her windpipe. Blood pooled beneath her, stark against the damp cobblestones. Unlike the previous victims, there were no grotesque abdominal wounds, no carved symbols left behind as a macabre signature. It was as if the killer had been interrupted, forced to flee before he could finish his grim work. But why? And by whom? Some speculated that Jack the Ripper had been moments away from carrying out his gruesome ritual when he was startled, perhaps by Deemschutz himself as he arrived with his cart. Others wondered if Elizabeth had fallen victim to a different killer altogether, one who sought to mimic the Ripper's handiwork but lacked his sadistic artistry. Theories swirled, each more chilling than the last, but the truth remained elusive, lost to the shadows of history. What was certain, however, was that Whitechapel would not sleep easy that night. The streets were restless with murmurs of terror, the air thick with the knowledge that a predator still roamed free. Elizabeth Stride's death left more questions than answers, another grim puzzle in a mystery that will haunt London for generations to come. Stride's body was found in Dutfield's yard, just outside the International Working Men's Educational Club. The wound on her throat was precise and efficient, severing her left carotid artery but stopping short of further mutilation. No defensive wounds, no sign of a struggle. Whoever killed her had done so swiftly and decisively. But the biggest mystery was what came next. Only 45 minutes after Stride's body was discovered, another woman, Catherine Eddowes, was found murdered in Mitre Square. This time, the brutal signature of Jack the Ripper was evident. Her body had been savagely mutilated, her face carved beyond recognition. Could he really have been interrupted during Stride's murder and then gone on to kill again so quickly? Or had someone else taken advantage of the Ripper hysteria to commit their own crime? The fear that gripped Whitechapel in those months was all-consuming. The spectre of Jack the Ripper loomed over every alleyway, every shadowed corner. The police, desperate yet seemingly powerless, patrolled the streets with little success. The people whispered of a madman, a butcher, a demon that stalked the night, choosing his victims with eerie precision. Stride's murder, unlike the others, left questions. Why had the Ripper stopped? Was he truly interrupted? And if so, what had startled him into fleeing before completing his ghastly ritual? As the city awoke, news of the double event spread like wildfire. The newspapers would print their lurid headlines, the theories would multiply, and the legend of Jack the Ripper would only grow. But for those who lived in Whitechapel, there was no mystery, only terror. Terror that he would strike again. Terror that no one was safe. And as the fog curled once more through the streets, swallowing the light and dampening the sound of frightened whispers, one thing was certain. The nightmare was far from over. The police were under immense pressure. The streets of Whitechapel were gripped by terror, and the newspapers demanded justice. The citizens of London, particularly those in the impoverished East End, were restless and fearful. Each new murder added fuel to the public's outrage, and the authorities found themselves overwhelmed by mounting frustration. The press was relentless, printing gruesome illustrations and speculating wildly about the identity of the killer, dubbing him Jack the Ripper. As the fog of fear thickened over Whitechapel, every shadow became suspect, and paranoia ran rampant. Witnesses came forward with conflicting accounts, further complicating an already convoluted investigation. Some claimed to have seen Elizabeth Stride in the company of a well-dressed man wearing a peaked cap, suggesting that her killer might have been someone who could blend easily into higher society. Others described a rough-looking figure with a dark mustache, a more familiar sight among the working-class men who populated the East End. Such disparities only deepened the mystery, making it nearly impossible for investigators to discern truth from fabrication. One particularly intriguing account came from a witness named Israel Schwartz, who reported seeing Stride being attacked near Dutfield's yard at approximately 12:45 a.m. He described the suspect as about 5 feet 5 inches in height, broad-shouldered, and exhibiting aggressive behavior as he shoved Stride to the ground. But what made Schwartz's testimony even more puzzling was the presence of another man nearby, who may have been an accomplice. This second man reportedly called out Lipsky, a term commonly used as an anti-Semitic slur at the time. Was this a signal to his companion, an attempt to threaten Schwartz, or simply an unfortunate coincidence? The uncertainty surrounding this event added another frustrating layer to the investigation. Further complicating matters was another mysterious figure seen earlier that evening, a man who had reportedly given Stride grapes. Some speculated that this man might have been her killer, while others suggested he was merely a passing acquaintance or even a client. But the question remained, who was he, and what role, if any, did he play in Stride's final moments? The police combed through the evidence, desperately trying to connect the dots. Yet, as with the other Ripper murders, there were no clear answers. Theories flourished, each more chilling than the last. Had the Ripper been interrupted in the act and fled before he could inflict the kind of gruesome mutilations seen in his other victims? Did he alter his usual pattern for reasons unknown? Or, more disturbingly, was Elizabeth Stride never meant to be one of his victims at all? Some experts suggested that her murder may have been the work of a different killer entirely. Perhaps a lover, a jealous rival, or a client whose temper had gotten the best of him. This idea was bolstered by the stark difference in the nature of Stride's injuries. Unlike the other Ripper victims, she bore no extensive mutilations, just a single, precise slash across her throat. This was highly uncharacteristic of Jack the Ripper, whose previous victims had suffered gruesome and sadistic post-mortem injuries. It led some to believe that her murder was a crime of passion rather than a calculated act by the infamous serial killer. But unlike Stride, Eddowes had suffered the full extent of the Ripper's fury. Her face was savagely disfigured, her body horrifically mutilated. The stark contrast between the two killings raised even more questions. Could the Ripper really have been interrupted during Stride's murder and then sought out another victim so quickly to satisfy his bloodlust? Or did someone else use the chaos and fear surrounding the Ripper murders to commit their own crime that same night? The police considered every possibility, questioning known criminals, searching through lodging houses, and analyzing every shred of evidence they could find. Yet, the deeper they dug, the more elusive the truth became. The streets of Whitechapel remained shrouded in fear, and the specter of Jack the Ripper loomed larger than ever. In the end, Elizabeth Stride's murder became one of the greatest ambiguities in the already confounding Ripper case. Theories and suspicions abounded, but no definitive answer was ever reached. Was she a victim of the Ripper, a casualty of some unknown killer, or merely an unfortunate woman who found herself in the wrong place at the wrong time? The truth, like the thick fog that blanketed Whitechapel that night, remains an enigma, lost to the darkness of history. Jack the Ripper's psychological profile suggested a need for power and control. His previous victims had been horrifically mutilated, their bodies almost ritualistically displayed. But Stride's murder lacked this element, suggesting either an interruption or an entirely different killer. Some believed that Stride was the victim of a domestic dispute gone wrong. She had known violent men before, including her longtime partner, Michael Kidney, who had a history of drunken abuse. Could he have followed her that night in a jealous rage? Others speculated that a copycat killer, aware of the growing hysteria surrounding the Ripper, used the fear as cover for their own crime. A crime of opportunity, one that, under normal circumstances, might not have gained the same level of infamy. Still, another theory suggested that the Ripper had chosen Stride as his victim but had been interrupted before he could carry out his signature mutilations. This would align with the chilling fact that Catherine Eddowes was murdered and mutilated just 45 minutes later in Mitre Square. Did the Ripper, frustrated by the premature ending of his first attack, seek out another victim to satisfy his compulsion? Yet another hypothesis points to gang violence. Whitechapel was rife with criminal enterprises, and protection rackets often turned violent. Stride may have crossed the wrong people, her death and execution rather than the work of a lone serial killer. There were also whispers of political intrigue. Some theories implicated high-ranking officials or the Freemasons in a grand conspiracy, using the Ripper killings as a smokescreen for more sinister activities. While largely speculative, such theories fed the paranoia and fear that gripped London at the time. Despite extensive investigations and growing public pressure, the police failed to bring the killer to justice. Witness testimonies were inconsistent, forensic science was primitive, and misinformation spread rapidly in the press. The murder of Elizabeth Stride remains an enigma, a dark and tangled mystery buried within the legend of Jack the Ripper. Was she an unfortunate casualty of a serial killer's bloodlust, or a victim of an entirely different crime lost to history? Just when it seemed the case might yield no answers, a cryptic piece of evidence emerged, the infamous Goulston Street graffito. Found near the scene of Catherine Eddowes' murder, the chalked message read, "Asterisk, the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Asterisk, was it a clue left by the Ripper? A red herring? Or something unrelated entirely? Meanwhile, Michael Kidney, Stride's partner, appeared at the police station in a drunken state, ranting about the case. He was questioned but ultimately released due to lack of evidence. Others, like John Pizer, a known violent criminal nicknamed Leather Apron, were also considered but eventually dismissed. As days turned into weeks, then months, then years, the case of Elizabeth Stride faded into the annals of history, an enigma within an enigma. More than a century later, the mystery of Elizabeth Stride remains unsolved. Was she truly one of Jack the Ripper's canonical 5 victims? Or was she merely a woman who met her end in the wrong place at the wrong time? Her murder remains one of the most debated aspects of the case, a puzzle piece that never quite fits. And as long as the legend of Jack the Ripper endures, so too will the shadow of Elizabeth Stride, a woman whose final moments were shrouded in silence, in mystery, and in blood. What do you think? Was Elizabeth Stride truly a Ripper victim? Or was her murder the work of someone else? Let us know in the comments.